Hello. So I've just been watching President Xi Jinping of China and his First Lady Peng Liyuan meet dignitaries from around the world. Today there is actually ongoing. There is a huge military parade in Beijing in Tiananmen Square to mark 70 years since World War II, exactly 70 years. And they're greeting dignitaries from around the world. Last time I checked the TV, CCTV 9 that is, which is an English language Chinese network. Um, the representative for the UK was Ken Clarke, is Ken Clarke, a former Justice Minister. Numerous other heads of state or representatives of countries visiting this event. Um, I want to speak a little bit about what I interpret to be the implications of this event, as well as some general thoughts on those implications. Now, on the surface, the purpose of this is to commemorate the sacrifice of World War II. Goes without saying, World War II was the most catastrophic conflict in human history. Anywhere from 55 million to 80 million dead. Um, every nation that was involved was impacted in an enormous way. China, of course, as one of the main allied nations, suffered enormously. Anywhere from 10 million to 20 million Chinese were killed in this conflict, which was the second highest losses after the Soviet Union. So China did suffer enormously. This parade is officially being called the commemoration of the war against Japanese aggression and also the commemoration of the worldwide war against fascism, meaning German Italian fascism. Um, in the UK, World War II is poignant. Of course, we were one of the major Allied countries involved. Our cities were heavily bombed. Now, to be fair, with each sort of representative of the country, I kind of got the impression this would be all China centric. But to be fair, the commentators gave a little piece of information about each country as the representative appeared. They said, for example, that London was one of the most bombed cities of World War II. Our cities were heavily bombed. German cities were bombed even more so. There isn't a country that was involved that didn't suffer badly. Germany and Japan, for example, although they were guilty of many war crimes, their civilians also suffered enormously um, in both countries. I think that it would be naive for anyone to think that this was purely a commemorative event. I I don't think that the Chinese side will kind of take this opportunity and not use it, at least to some extent, to politicize the current situation. I mean, of course, they're not going to explicitly do that, but um, there will inevitably be a lot of analysis as to the consequences. Now, regardless of the current situation, it is right that the event is commemorated simply because it was such a massive war and because so many people died. So that's totally understandable. But given the current tensions in the Pacific region, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the more hawkish Chinese state-run newspapers use this to politicize the situation today. I mean, Russia has done similar things in terms of sort of showing off some of its military arsenal. So there was analysis of why Japan isn't making an appearance in today's event. It could be twofold. Firstly, there's a big focus on the military aspect. China, along with several other countries that's close to, such as Venezuela and Russia, are um, taking part in military. It's very much China centric. I mean, a lot of the weaponry is Chinese, but it is largely a military event. And given Japan's pacifist post-war constitution, I think there would be controversy for a Japanese politician with the Japanese public to turn up at a military event. Um, on the other hand, that could be interpreted in a negative way in itself, that Japan's kind of snubbing its war guilt, or I think both sides could probably speculate it as they will. The Chinese side may think that Japan is missing an opportunity to show that it cares. The Japanese may think that it's just China trying to get one over on them and sort of use this event to humiliate them almost. Um, I think it's a bit of a pity there's no Japanese representation. I would have liked to see. Obviously, a handshake would be a formality. That's the way it goes. I mean, we all saw last year the handshake between Xi Jinping and Shinzo Abe could not have been more icy. Nevertheless, it would have been interesting to see the consequences of that. I've been following this situation. The reason there's so little talk about the German relations with the rest of Europe is because they are so good. I'm not talking necessarily in the framework of the EU. Like, obviously, relations with Germany and Greece isn't great right now, but generally speaking, between Germany and France, Germany and Britain, relations are very good overall. And even where there is big differences, they tend to be resolved within the framework of the EU. In Asia, hostility is a lot more fractious, a lot more on the surface, not just between China and Japan, but also between Japan and South Korea, between the two Koreas, between North Korea and Japan, between China and its neighbors. So I believe this region is very much. I don't think we're going to see a major conflict anytime soon. Because I think responsible people on both sides will ensure that doesn't happen. But nevertheless, alarm bells have been rang with Shinzo Abe's more hawkish positions on things, um, as well as a Chinese president who's focusing on nationalism instead of traditional communist rhetoric. I mean, the Xi Jinping era so far can be defined as really, really focusing on um, pushing Chinese power. They say it's a peaceful rise, and so far it is largely peaceful, but nevertheless, there is a lot of question marks being raised, not just from Japan, but from smaller countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, and so on. Um, so there's a few things I'd like to say as an outsider. Of course, China suffered enormously in World War II. There could be no denying of that fact. But there is a lot of focus in the Chinese media about Japan's inconsistency and their supposed lack of willingness to take responsibility for the war guilt in the same way that Germany done. On some level, I can understand this criticism because the Japanese position has sort of been inconsistent. On one hand, there has been a lot of public apologies and expressions of deep regret, this sort of thing. And I have no doubt that Japan is a very, very different country from what it was in the 40s. So much so that the Japanese people even panic if there's even any hint of militarism. So Japan today, I really do believe, is a very different society. But as one commentator, outside commentator, pointed out in CCTV, to be fair, there were left-wing Japanese were also responsible for exposing Japan's war guilt in the 1950s and 1960s. And, they took a lot of heat for that. So Japan is a democratic country. It's a country that certainly has a much greater degree of free expression than China does. And there is a lot of internal discussion about this within Japan. So, I think it would be unfair of the Chinese editorials to sort of present the Japanese people as being militaristic and so on, because I do think that there is a widespread recognition in Japanese society that their country was culpable of some terrible things in the Second World War. Of course, that's not going to apply to everyone. There's going to be people who deny it, but you get that in every country. Um, as an outsider, I think one of the issues that's been raised a few times is that why does China make such a big deal out of this when, number one, it wasn't the only country that suffered from Japanese aggression. Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia, many other countries in the region, not to mention allied prisoners of war, suffered enormously from Japanese aggression. And they suffered exactly the same way the Chinese did, issues that comfort women and so on. Although I do, I mentioned the inconsistency with the Japanese position, that there is public apologies, but then it doesn't help that you get senior Japanese politicians saying things that senior German politicians would never get away with. Things like denying the existence of comfort women, for instance. Shinzo Abe, although he's not been guilty of this himself, he has been very close to some of these people. So that would be the equivalent in Germany of Angela Merkel being friends with Holocaust deniers. So I think those of us on the other side do need to understand where the Chinese sensitivities come from. I mean, when I say China suffered, it really, really did suffer in a profound way. Anyone who's seen the film The Flowers of War, okay, you could argue it's a biased film, but nevertheless, it is easy to understand why Chinese sensitivities are as raw as they are. On the other hand, China doesn't always help their claim that they're only interested in peace. I mean, you can go into Chinese marketplaces and find T-shirts literally depicting the Japanese as devils and this sort of thing. And you can go to tourist sites and dress up as a Chinese soldier bayoneting a Japanese with horns in his head. And there's something very undiplomatic and childish about the way that China responds to this. And I don't think China needs to understand that's not going to get international sympathy because most of the world agrees that China suffered enormously. But this approach um, doesn't help. I really don't think that helps. And I've even seen Chinese people agreeing with that. I mean, one thing about China, and obviously this is true of any country, but you can't generalize the Chinese people. Not every Chinese is hates the Japanese. I have Chinese friends who've been to Japan who love the Japanese culture and who are very open-minded on this. So we should, although Japan's got a more democratic and open system, the Chinese aren't all taken in by this neo-nationalism. I don't think. Nevertheless, it's quite widespread, and you will see a lot of stuff online. Unfortunately, I mean, for example, with the commemoration of the A bombs, a lot of Chinese some Chinese are mature about it and they sort of recognize that innocent people suffered, but there's other Chinese that kind of mock that event and say, "Oh, well, the Japanese deserved it because of what they'd done in Nanking," and it kind of becomes a situation like they done this, and becomes like a point scoring thing, which I think is very unfortunate. 70 years on, this would be inconceivable in Europe. Um, so I think that's really unfortunate. Another thing, as an outsider, I have to say this, and this will be controversial, but very often, like I say, the Chinese will accuse, especially the Japanese government, of hiding from its own past. Now, maybe that's true to an extent, insofar as, like I say, you do get senior Japanese politicians denying the culpability of Japan during World War II and trying to whitewash history. And it is right that that is criticized because as soon as you whitewash history, you don't learn from history. But I would say that I think China is being hypocritical because I'm not talking about World War II, but in other aspects of history, China absolutely hides from its own past, or at least covers its own past. I mean, the sheer amount of excuses made for Chairman Mao and his hideous regime is um, is very profound. Um, More Chinese died under Mao's regime than under the Japanese, and almost every source will indicate that. Um, you know, uh, Between 10 and 20 million Chinese died during the Second World War. Um, Anywhere from 40 to 70 million Chinese perished under Mao's regime through starvation, which is brought about by his economic policies, through forced suicide, through executions, through purges. This was one of the darkest events in human history. And to this day, China still heavily censors those events. And you pick up a Chinese textbook, and I know this for a fact because I have one, it basically glosses over these things. Um, the events of 1989 are still censored. So I think that China is somewhat hypocritical when they accuse Japan of hiding from its past, when China does exactly the same thing. And not just internally speaking, China doesn't exactly have a glowing track record in terms, Beijing often presents itself as being this very passive power. That's very questionable. China may not have the military experience of the United States or the UK or France in recent years, but for example, in 1978, China invaded North Vietnam. In 1959, there was they call it the liberation of Tibet. Many others would say the invasion of Tibet. There is a lot of controversies that China also needs to answer to, but because China is a single party state, there is no free debate on these things. Now, To Chinese viewers watching this, you may not like what I'm saying, but I'm telling you now, if you do not have free debate on a subject, and by free debate, I'm talking about within China, of course you can debate with me if you have a VPN or you're in a Western country that does have a largely free internet. I'm talking about within China. There is no debate on these things because the perpetrator was the Chinese government. Therefore, I do think there is double standards. In other words, it's perfectly okay to vilify Japan, sell anti-Japanese T-shirts, but if young men in Shandong province trample on portraits of Mao, they get arrested. And that happened not so long ago. So I do think there's a lot of hypocrisy within the context of Chinese nationalism. I do understand where it comes from. In the 19th century, China was humiliated, that's true. But China today has come a very long way since then. And China today, and we shouldn't overlook this point, China today is a very powerful country. So the rest of the world doesn't really, when China presents itself as the victim, that kind of wears thin when you consider China is a very powerful country in today's context. So what I would say is, yes, I understand the sensitivities. Yes, I fully understand that China suffered enormously. In fact, when I've had this discussion with some Chinese friends, um, they got quite defensive and said, like they almost wanted to prove to me what Japan done. But the thing is, that I'm not disputing what Japan done. It's more a point about inconsistency. And well, if you're going to accuse Japan of not being honest about its past, then you have to agree that China also is not honest about its past. Now, China never committed the war crimes against Japan that Japan committed against China. That's true, but the Chinese government committed some terrible crimes against its own people, and that's something that to this day is largely overlooked or downplayed, and I think that's very, very unfortunate. So, if the lesson of today's parade is to learn from history, that should apply to every country. Yes, should apply to Japan, but also China. Obviously, the event is about World War II. It isn't about the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward, but the principle that countries should recognize their past needs to apply. Now, the official line of the Communist Party today is that Mao made mistakes. Um, so it's basically trivialized, and it's that really frustrates me as an outsider because China all too often makes itself out to be the victim, not just with the Japanese situation, but not long ago I was speaking to someone on QQ, and she said, "Do you know what happened to the Summer Palace in 1865 or whatever year it was?" And I knew full well what she was getting at. She was talking about the Opium War and when the British burned it down. And I said, "Well, look, I'm not proud of what my country done, but that just demonstrates this new nationalism in China, which is pretty much blame every other country, whether it be Japan or European colonial powers, for the things they done, but turn a blind eye to the things that the Chinese government has done." And that does frustrate me sometimes, um, simply because it's dishonest and it is inconsistent. I don't have a problem with Chinese people sort of remembering history and remembering what Japan done, but I do have a problem with then kind of making excuses for the Communist Party and the things that they done. Okay, so I'll leave it there. There isn't really too much to add to this. It's going to be an interesting event. This may be a record-breaking parade in terms of the numbers involved. In fact, it's probably ongoing right as I'm speaking. They said about half an hour. That was about half an hour ago, so I might go down and check it out. Certainly going to be an interesting event. I just hope that relations can improve between China and Japan, and I believe both countries have responsibility. I don't think there's going to be another war because I believe both countries rely too much on one another. And I think both sides can help. Japan, for its part, needs to be consistent. It can't sort of apologize on one hand and then kind of think that's okay and then deny some very dubious and controversial events on the other. And China, for its part, needs to also be aware of how it appears to the rest of the world. Right now, China comes across as a regional bully, especially over fishing disputes and this expansionist program. They will say it's not expansionism, but they need to understand, and by they I'm talking about the Chinese government. They need to see how that looks to the rest of the world. Traditionally, in my opinion, Chinese leadership has been very arrogant and not really cared what the rest of the world thinks. Of course, you could say the same of the United States, but it's the nature of superpowers. China today is behaving a bit like the US and the UK did in history, sort of taking the view, well, we're a powerful country, we don't really care what people think. So China has to respect international opinion on this and international perspective. Just to be clear, this is a final point I'll make. Obviously, a lot of this video, I'm quite critical of some of the action that China's taking, but um, I'm very, I love China. I think China's a great country. I'm very passionate about China. I think, this is not intended to be an anti-China video. Some of the most important people in my life are Chinese. And I fully recognize the contention of what happened 70 years ago. And I understand you can't just move on from something as with that sort of gravitas. I just think that there should be consistency and more honesty on both sides, not just from, it's not fair to just expect Japan to be honest and then for Beijing to completely censor its own history. Okay, let me know your thoughts. If you're a Chinese national, I hope you've listened to me and haven't just jumped to conclusions. You don't have to agree with me, but I would ask that you keep it civil. I've tried to be as respectful as possible in this. Um, yeah, and if you disagree with what I'm saying, I would ask you to explain why. I mean, how can you justify censoring your own history, for example? How can you justify making an exclusion zone in the Pacific that goes well beyond previous boundaries and so on? Because that's just escalating the situation. As for the islands, personally, I don't care about them. I'm talking about the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. No one lives there, but I am concerned about the implications of it. So let me know your thoughts, and thank you for watching.